Welcome back to my channel. Just to let you know, we're almost at 10,000 subscribers. We're getting there. Come on, we can do it. If you're new to my channel, this is a channel for ASMR and for relaxation. So don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and follow, and share, and like. I've dressed for the occasion for this video because I'm going to be talking about the years of the 60s and the 70s and the fantastic 80s and so on as growing up, you see. The lifestyles and all the great things. Just because back then, when you had the greasers, with their leather jackets and their white t-shirts, it was something very special. But before I can get into that, I have to go back, like right to the beginning. And I was just going through the papers before I crossed the puzzle. But that's not why. When I go way back, some things like in the 60s, because I was born in 62. So when I first started off, some of the first things that I could remember in the 60s growing up was the lifestyle, the colors, the passions for love and, friendships and all kinds of fantastic things, Of course, we didn't have all that technology, but that made us do things instead of just sitting in front of the TV or on the cell phone. I got here some coupons. I was just cutting up some coupons because back then, something I remember very young, and that was sitting at the kitchen table and cutting up coupons. Today, it's all these QR codes that you scan. But back then, the fun part was that you could cut them out of the newspaper or your local grocery info page or whatever you had that you could get. And sometimes you could save 2, 3, sometimes even up to 5 cents per item. But it wasn't that. It was the feel of the paper, the coupons, the feel of having them in your hands and cutting them out. But that wasn't my funnest part. My funnest part was knowing what my mother was going to buy by looking at the coupons. Get my favorite cereal or maybe even some junk. Who knows? Not only that, when I was like 3 or 4, I started taking my first swimming lessons. And I can remember when we would go to the pool, like me and my siblings, because I started getting my first lessons at around 3. My mom wanted me to start early taking lessons because I loved water back then. And she knew I would be a fast learner because my other siblings, especially, my sister wasn't born yet. She was going to come later. But I had my older sister and my older brother. And for some reason, my older brother didn't like water as much. And this is in this city because I grew up young in Montreal, Quebec, in LaSalle, the city of LaSalle. And growing up in this city in the 60s, it was very different from today, of course. Sometimes you didn't even lock your doors. I mean, everybody knew everybody, your neighbors. Everything was friendly, that I remember, of course. And getting back, I remember my swimming lessons. And I learned very fast. And seeing that I was in the water, my siblings, of course, my brother, my older sister, which basically was my brother, saw me in the water swimming. And he dived in. He just jumped in, saying, I can do it too. If you can do it, I can do it. Well, of course, it didn't take him long either to learn how to swim. So that was just one thing back that I can remember. But another thing too was the shopping back in the 60s. The shopping malls, the shopping centers, the stores. Like, there were so many different variety of stores that you could go to and see different things. And I remember this one place that we used to go. It was called Norrell. This was you would say it was like a butcher shop, where they would sell meat, but like wholesale, like big. And there was like so much meat and all kinds of picklings and things in barrels. So my mom would go with us shopping, and then we would select different cuts of meat. And she would get these blades. I call them blades. They're like a roast, about, maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches thick by 10 inches. And she would get quite a few because we had a country place back then that my mom had bought, for not expensive because it needed a lot of cleaning and a lot of work, which I'll get back to. So she would buy, various cuts of meat that we could bring up to the country place and cook on the fire. Because back then, as I was getting older in the 60s, I learned how to make fire up north, the country place, very early at a young age. And of course, then my sister was born, my younger sister. We have about 4 years difference. So she was born, and I was getting in an age where I was getting more and more curious. But still, back in the city, like before I go into the country, back in the city, our activities were limited. Because when you're young, and of course, sometimes you had to have supervision, but that was rare because we learned how to be responsible. We got our first bikes and we would ride around just close by the park, whatever. And we were taught, respect and how to respect things, material things, so that they would last. And with our bikes, like I said, we would go to the park, we would go around. We were taught, traffic and traffic signs and, how to be very safe, not to have things happen. So, as we got a little bit older, towards the late 60s, I would say, I was getting to be like around 7, 8 years old then. And we were getting more adventurous in the city. We would go further with our bikes. And that's when I started to learn about sports and, how to start being mischievous, of course. It wasn't always my fault. That's the lifestyle. And, we'd go sometimes by the waterfront, pick up some shells or clams or frogs or whatever. But also, we would go play tennis. And sometimes, we didn't have any tennis balls or anything, but we were lucky because we were able to get some tennis rackets that Mom had got us. But what we did is we'd climb up onto the roof of the high school, because the corners of the high school were like a ladder. The bricks were overlaying one another, and we could climb up. That was about 12 feet high, So we would climb up the corner and get on the roof. We could pick up tennis balls, there were soccer balls, footballs, all kinds of things that we would pick up and throw them down. So then we would have things to play with. Because back then you didn't return them. Finders, keepers, losers, weepers. And then we would go play tennis, but we'd also practice, throwing the football, playing some baseball, different activities. Growing up, of course. But this is the city. And then you start to have friends, and you start to do things that are naughty, Like sometimes we would throw things at the cars, and it wasn't right sometimes what we were doing. But then again, that was being influenced by the times, what was happening back then. And kids were learning. We were all learning, because the 60s was a year when things started to progress. Things started to grow. And people started learning about, how to be more, I would say, mischievous in doing things that you couldn't do before. Because technology did start coming out. And people got more and more influenced by other, TV shows or whatever was coming out. So it was always what you would learn or, see. But it was still a very quiet and serene lifestyle. So, like I was saying, then, once we had gone shopping or whatever, we'd come back to the apartment and start packing to go up north. And when we would go up north, the country was a total different, upbringing than in the city. Because like I was saying, in the 60s in the city, you didn't have as many activities as you had in the country. For me, because of course, I was more a country boy growing up. And I remember very young when I was up north country, I got my first fishing rod. My uncle had taught me how to fish. Put the worm on the hook and, cast it in the water. And we had a river that sometimes would go very fast. And we had to learn to be very careful not to get caught in the river and, drift away. So, growing up, every morning when I was in the country, I would be 6 o'clock in the morning. Where was I? I was outside by the river with my fishing rod, fishing. And that was like one of my fondest memories, and it was so relaxing, so calm and so peaceful. And then came the best part of everything, when we would start cooking something on the fire. Couldn't do that in the city unless you had like one of those charcoal barbecues. But we would wait. Mom would wait till we got up north for our summer vacations. And then we would go and cook something on the fire. All meantime, while cleaning up the place and learning about repairs and, physical work. That's how you become a man. Yeah. Hard work. Planting trees and hauling earth and sand and wheelbarrows and all kinds of things. Because you couldn't have fun all the time. You had to do some work. But we always had some kind of compensation for what we were doing. A little something. And the music was special then. I remember in the 60s, at a young age, listening to rock and roll and a lot of Elvis. There was a lot of that type of music. And there seemed to be a lot of dancing, a lot of dancing to the music because the beat was special. And we would have these little parties between us, with my cousins and whatever, because the family would get together. And the aunts and uncles, we all had like a country place close by. So all the family would get together and we would have these campfires and cooking marshmallows and telling stories and, all kinds of nice and fun activities. Something that we couldn't do in the city back then in the 60s. But like I said, we didn't have all the technology, that you just sit by the computer or the TV and not do anything. We were outside mostly all the time doing something, either swimming, sports, doing some kind of activity like like I said, fishing. But we had our tents. We'd camp. We'd fires, walks, all kinds of things, like role plays. That's when, sometimes I get really excited because that's when your imagination would peak. And we would use our imagination for role plays. Like, are you an adventurer? Are you a hunter? Are you a pirate? We would invent these games, like playing hide and seek and things, but we would add things to a next level. And we didn't get this off of a computer or off TV. It was our imagination. Yeah. That was the fun part. And that's what I remember. And I always tried, growing up, to keep this sort of mentality, if you want. But that's the way I was, and that's the way I still am today. I try and keep the activities going as much as I can. And then, still in the 60s, towards the late end of the 60s, like I said, we were going into the 70s, and I was getting older. And then, of course, lifestyles changed again in the 70s. I go for about every 10 years, that I can. And starting in the 70s, when I was I was 9, let's say, when I was starting in the 70s. And that 9, you're starting high school, was it high school? No, I don't think I was in high school yet. No, I think, because in Quebec here, our high school, our schooling, primary school and high schools and that, the time and age is different than elsewhere. Because you would start your high school at grade 7 or 8 and finish grade 11. So basically, you'd finish high school, you were around 16 or 17. And nine years old, then you started learning about responsibility. But the music started to change. Disco came out, and, you had the rock and roll was becoming more modern. But it was like the year of love and peace in the 70s. And I remember, the best part for me was the cars. Oh my, the sports cars, the classic cars, the Mustangs, the Chargers, Challengers, Barracudas, and I can go on and on and on. Mustangs, and they came out with all these fancy sports cars, and they had these motors, and they had these flashy colors, and but also the way people dressed with flower power and fancy flying t-shirts, and of course came out with leather jackets that people would wear, but mostly it was the colors I remember. And then you would watch the cars go by, and you could try and guess what kind of car it was, or what kind of make, sometimes just by the sound alone. But that was like the 70s. And people were starting to learn how to roller skate. I had tried that. I was like 10. Tried to roller skate at It took a while to get the knack of it. But, it's not bad. That was something we would do when we went back to the city. That was one activity that was starting to grow. Disco and roller skating. Yeah. You'd go sometimes to the local diner and they would bring you your food like you see in the movies on a tray and on roller skates. Well, that was back in the 50s probably that it started. But I was really too young. I wasn't even born in the 50s, but in the 60s, I was too young to really notice at first. But it got to be because we didn't go to the diner. No, couldn't afford it. I was young, And like I said, you couldn't see it really on TV or anything because we didn't get a TV probably until the late 60s. And it was a black and white one anyways. But like I said, we weren't ones to be plugged in just to the TV. Saturday mornings, cartoons, of course. And sometimes those comedy shows like I Love Lucy or, All in the Family when it first came out. But that was later. It was like the Gleason show. Anyways, some of those comedy shows back then. But like I'm saying, okay, now it's the 70s and, I'm getting older. But then, things happen. And Mom and Dad got divorced because things weren't going good between them. So, and not only that, as you're getting older, you question life, you question things. And we never really questioned our mother about our father because Dad was a very quiet person. He didn't express feelings. He didn't, he wasn't one to outgo. And I remember young, he would listen to his radio, his small radio, after work, coming home in the evening. And he would listen to baseball on his small radio. And I remember listening through my bedroom door, to him listening to his baseball games. And I would fall asleep on that. I don't know why, but there's something about a baseball game, that just knocked me out, really. That was another thing I remembered growing up. But anyways, back to the 70s. Like I said, then I was getting older and my mom and dad were separated. So he decided that he was going to stay in the city, in the apartment, and that we were going to move out because, you see, like I was saying, we were starting to be mischievous and we were getting influenced by some of our friends, if you could call them friends. But, sometimes we would steal cigarettes because my parents smoked. And we would steal cigarettes off my mother, just a few. And we started trying to smoke, that's bad, real bad, But back then it wasn't that bad because everybody was doing it, That's where you were influenced. And then my mom was worried that we would get, into maybe drugs or alcohol or something even worse. Because of course that's when LSD and all those drugs started coming out too, And seeing my parents were divorced, my mom was saying, okay, well, we're going to do something. So we had family that lived, in the eastern townships, like Magog, and these are places you could look up if you want in eastern townships, like Magog, and we had these places like Queticook, and Stansted was on the border to the States, to Maine, but we had family. And we decided, well, Mom decided, we were still young, she decided she was going to go take a look to see what was out there. So we went to stay at some families' houses that, like, on my grandma's side, I would say. And there was a family, like our cousins, or second, third generation cousins, and that they had a farm. So my mom, they opened us, like opened arms. They opened their arms to us and said, well, look, come and move in with us. And we were not farmers, you're country folks, but like I said, we had that country place that we learned about country and how to do some manual work. So the farming part wouldn't be as hard to pick up, because we already had some experience. So Mom packed up, left Dad in the city, and we moved to the country, the real country, farming country, if you want. And then things started, because that's where you really had to learn responsibility and how to handle machinery and all kinds of stuff. So like I'm about 13, I would say, back then. That was like in 74, 75, roughly, let's say. And yeah, something like that. Let's say 75. And I'm learning how to drive tractors, and because of course my brother was older, so of course he would be the one that would learn first, because there was hay to be done and plowing and all kinds of farm activities, taking care of the animals. But what I remember was the machinery. And when you started to learn how to drive a stick shift, because there was no automatic tractors back then, they were all manual. So of course you had to learn how to drive manual. And I learned very fast how to drive a tractor. And then, you learned how to pin up a wagon, how to drive the tractor, and what happens if you get stuck, or how to maintenance, how to take care of the tractor, check the oil, fill it up, check the tire pressure, all these things about mechanics that you started to learn. And I know I've talked a lot about farm activities and farming in my other videos. But the basic points, like I was saying, in the 70s, was the cars, and in the country, like in the city, you had some of the fancier cars that were coming out, Rolls Royce and Cadillacs and stuff like that. But in the country, like I said, they were sports cars, basically, or these bigger models that people sometimes kept, like the classics, the 57 Chevys and Bel Airs and stuff that people took care of. So you had these. But we had a 57 Chevy, a Bel Air. And this thing was turning into a rust pot. But the motor was still working. And I remember driving it for my first time because we would use it. Can you believe it? Back then, they would use it as a pickup truck and fill up the trunk with sand and other things, because they didn't have a pickup truck. But that was then, because cars weren't that expensive. Well, yes, they were expensive for the money that you would have, but they weren't expensive like today. To compare, not the same at all. And I've talked about that in my previous videos. But it was like the people that would come and see you, or people sometimes would come and help us on the farm, and what they'd drive up in. What kind of adventure would we have today with what kind of car, or what cousin would show up, and sometimes we have these little parties or get-togethers. But okay, but that's what I'm saying. The 70s, the lifestyle, and then we got our first color TV. But that didn't stop me. That didn't stop me from being outside and continuing to do those activities. But also at the same time in the country, you see, we got away from the city, the corrupted part of the city. Like I was saying, drugs, and when gangs started coming out and stuff like that. We got away from that. Because in the country, you defended your own territory. And when you're talking, you have 200 or 300 acres of land. It's a lot of territory. But the villains in the country were basically the animals that you had to watch out for. Because sometimes there were coyotes or bears or even wolves. But it wasn't for us. It's what they would do, to our animals. Because sometimes you'd lose chickens or you'd lose rabbits, or sometimes they would even try and attack goats or whatever you had, or pigs or anything like that. So that's when you had to be a protector of your animals and your family. And I'm saying, like, I'm 15, okay, in the 70s. And Grandma decided to come and move in with us. Mom was taking care of Grandma, the farmhouse, because we had quite a big family. And Grandma noticed that I was having trouble, doing my manly part of protecting the family, because I didn't have a gun. Oh yes, I had one of those fiberglass bow and arrows, but I couldn't kill a coyote with that. So Grandma, what she did is she went and she gave me $200 to go buy a gun, my first gun. So I went and I got myself my first gun. I think it was my brother-in-law that came with me so that I could get the gun. But then I turned 16. I was 16, and that's when I was able to register it, to be able to use it. So I got my first gun. But Mom didn't know anything about that. Grandma never told her. So she was bewildered and floored when she found out I had a gun. It was a 12 gauge. And I had to learn about a gun, and I had to learn about respect of the gun and how to use it. It wasn't just like those cowboy movies. And this thing had a kick to it. Like, I mean, my shoulder was sore from the kick it would give, because you had to use it to practice. And that's what I would do. I would go up to the woods. I would have a lot of shotgun shells. And I'd go up to the woods, and then I would put cans, like in the movies. I would put cans on the fence posts or whatever, and I'd practice shooting them. And I would spend hours and hours practicing and shooting until my shoulder was almost blue, you know. But that's how I toughened up, you know, my shoulders. I could keep on practicing. And then I was getting better and better at this. I would sometimes shoot the cans up in the air and shoot them, then shoot them again. But then I was getting an obsession, you know. Not only was I able now to go hunting, I was able to protect our territory at a very young age. I was able to drive machinery. So things were evolving. And then came the 80s. Ooh, the 80s. And then I was turning into a young man, of course. So again, in the 80s, things changed. And then on the farm, things were going bad. Yeah. I try and keep the positive as much as possible in my videos. But sometimes things happen. And of course, we started losing money because, like I've mentioned, we got into pig farming. And in the 80s, the price dropped. But the feed and everything kept on going up for the price. So we were losing money. So eventually, we had to sell the farm. Didn't have a choice. And this was in the 80s, okay? You know, everybody separated. Parts of the family built houses further away. But we had to, you know, maximize our losses, you know, to get back some of the money. So, you know, we sold everything to get back, like I said, maximize, you know, some of the money, get back some of the money. And this farmhouse, we did a lot of repairs. It was over 100 years old, and we sort of modernized it. And I've also talked about that before. But we had to sell the farm, and then we had to move out. And that's when we got into the suburbs. And this is, like I said, in the 80s. But then, seeing there was no more farm, I had to start looking for work. So, different types of jobs. And that's when my learning process started to grow even more. Because I already had a basis on city life, and I also had a basis on country life. So Mom decided that we were going to move out to the suburbs. It was close by, but it was more 50-50. You had country, but you also had small town city life. But small, not big cities. Big cities were about an hour away that you could drive to for the bigger hospitals or whatever. But then we got the house, and I fixed myself a little room downstairs in the basement that I could live. In the meantime, that I was looking for, maybe my own apartment or whatever. But first I had to get a job. I started off, back then, like when I was 17, 18, I started off, getting a job back on a farm. But that didn't last very long because I had a conflict with the owner. Yeah, they weren't safe. And I was one that was taught safety very young. And I didn't like what they were doing. Too dangerous. Sometimes cutting wood or whatever in the pouring rain and everything was slippery. You don't do that, not with machinery. So then I diversified. And I'm putting this, like I said, in categories of my upbringing. But then, like I said, in the 80s, things started to modernize even more. And then they started coming out with these compact cars, and cars that were more energy efficient, cost less in gas and mileage and all that. So, but I still didn't have I had my sports cars, like I said, I've mentioned before, my Mustang, when I got my Javelin and all that. But I didn't have them anymore because they were sold, they were gone, scrapped, whatever, which I could probably make another video one day about that. But then no, it's true, because I still had my Javelin when I started my landscaping job in the 80s. I remember that. Yes, because I would take my Javelin too. And that's when I was doing landscaping after the farm work. Did landscaping. I worked on a garbage truck. And then I went to work for a painter. And that's where, I've said before, I paint barns and, spray paint and learn about painting. Besides the other jobs that I had already started. Because the garbage truck and stuff like that was in the winter, and the painting construction jobs was in the summer. But then, like I said, technology advanced and changed, and things started coming out. Color TVs and boom boxes, music, and heading towards the 90s, but the 80s again, like I said, the music in the 80s too was really special, when it started coming out with all that rock, and then you had alternative music that started, but the 80s pop music was like, wow, And then too, like I said, the cars started changing. The way you would dress also started changing. Colors were getting toned down. You were starting to wear khakis that were coming out, and beige colors, white colors, darker colors, more t-shirts and jogging suits came out, and more comfortable, cozy clothes, I would say. And then, I was getting older, then of course the parties, because I started when I turned 16, because I was pretty tall back then too. I was skinny like a toothpick, but, I was still strong because of all the work I did. And my 16th birthday, my brother-in-law and my brother, because he was 18, we went to the bar where, I would have my first beer at the bar. And then I learned about bar life. And then, the ambiance, same French, the feeling of a bar, the music and the ladies and the dancing and all that stuff. But I was never ticketed to find out my age, because I passed like as an older boy, an older person. then, as time went by, then I got my first compact car. And this is past the 80s. This is heading in towards the 90s. Okay, because now I'm getting over 20s, my 20s. Yeah. And I'm starting to think of, maybe settling down myself. Because then, of course, seeing that I had painting experience and some other experience of different jobs, I started thinking of maybe working in a shop. And I worked for some, car repair shops and, body repair shops and stuff like that. But that's not what I wanted. And I had gone back and done some schooling too, to learn about welding and mechanics and different types of jobs, but also to learn how to grow my knowledge for various, different jobs. So then, once I had acquired some of the tools, I went to work for a paint company, which I've said, this was before I became a technician. But I went to work for a paint company. And this was a big paint company. So I started off at the bottom of the ladder, and I worked my way up. Started back like at the bottom of the chain, and then I worked my way up to be a finishing painter. And I've also mentioned that in my previous videos. And I worked there quite a few years, like almost 10 years working there. But this was in the 90s, heading towards 2000, and I wanted a family. I wanted responsibility because I was starting to get good pays and I was starting to grow. Had, another car, got a van. So that's when also my driving experience too, was even growing more. Because then I was starting to drive automatic too, besides just manual. But it's always good to have the two, like to learn manual. You never know. So then I was working in the shop. That's when I met my ex, and we started having a family. And I had an apartment, because I moved out from mom, this. And then I had my own apartment. She moved in with me, the apartment, and then we started to have a family. And then I decided, after that, the 90s, I said, okay, well, maybe it would be time to have a home. So then went out, got a house, and that's where I am now. Okay, this is my home, my family home, my home. This is what I bought, okay, back then in the 90s. That's when I had my daughter, my first child, our first child. So then got the house, moved in. I had the job as a painter, and I was bringing in good money. Had a 2-door garage. My ex, I can't say wife because we weren't really married. We were living together, but we weren't really married. So my ex then, she had her car, but she was a stay-home mom. She was supposed to take care of the children while I was working, you see. And things were going. There was a lot of repairs here too. But I already had a decent background of know-how. And that's why I mention it a lot. Say, grow your bank of knowledge as much as you can. Because as you're going to get older, You know, if you're just starting off in life, as you're going to get older, you're going to need that bank of knowledge to do certain things. If you want to, of course. But then, like I said, I started to do repairs, plumbing, electricity, all kinds of things that normally you would have to hire somebody to do. And sometimes you needed a license to do certain jobs or certain things, or a permit or whatever. But you get the information, learn how to do it, then you process it, and then you do it. So then, you know, the 2000s were coming up. Family was growing, things were getting different, communications, technology, everything was changing again. You know, every 10 years something was changing. And then, of course, things were starting to go bad between me and my girl, my ex. And I'm not going to say why or reasons or whatever. Things were just not working out anymore, you know. And we already had been together, you know, I would say for maybe, over 10 years. I had 3 children. So then decided to separate. So I kept the house. She wanted to get out, get an apartment. So, and then we had what we call, you know, garde partagée. You know, it was shared guardianship of the children. So, and then, of course, I lose my job. They close the doors at the shop, the paint shop, after I had been working there for so many years. But I was able to pick up another job fast with my experience. And this job was working like evenings and nights, but still painting. And as the children were getting older, things were changing, technology was changing. Everything was changing and fast, you know, heading up towards 2000, 2010. Everything was different, you know. And then there was no more painting contracts. So I got what's called unemployment insurance, you know, because I was out of work. But I didn't waste a minute. I said it would be a good time for me to go back to school and learn another trade, something I could add on to what I already had in experience. I'm not even cutting on more coupons. But then I took up electronics. So I learned about my technician. This is when my technician life started, you know. So I learned about domestic repairs on various equipment like radios, TVs, sound systems, and car radios, and DVDs, and anything that could be repaired. And back then, technology was at a boom, and there was a lot of repairs to be done. Yeah, so we were working like on a chain, like almost in a factory, but in an electronics store. And you would repair one item after another because it was contracts. Like sometimes you'd have these DVD players all in one combines, you know, together, and they would have this one default. So you just have to replace one part. And boom, 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 boom. We'd keep on doing this, you know, for a few years. And then technology changed again. Then computers were coming out more and more. And as technology grew, it also lowered in its standards. You didn't have the same quality because things were becoming, you could throw them out or recycle them. So basically, my job as a technician was going down the drain because I had nothing else to repair, you know. And like in 2010, 2015, heading towards 2020, getting close to where we are now. So then, my boss, they came out with these satellite dishes for Bell, Star Choice. And my boss got into this. And he trained me, like I said. And then I learned about installing satellite dishes. And then there was a boom. And that's where I took over. I had the truck, I had everything. So I was able to, sort of start up my own business because I had my own agenda and everything. So I started doing that, and I learned very quickly. And then after that, I could, handle the job by myself. But then again, things change and things evolve, and cable was coming out more and more, and cell phones were coming out, and things were really, really booming. And seeing that people were not getting the satellite dishes as often as before, I had to start thinking about changing my job opportunities again, once more. And I said, okay, what am I going to go into next? I said, okay, in the meantime, I've got these satellite dishes and the realignments and stuff that I could do, just to keep on working and having myself money, because I had mortgage to pay and alimony and all kinds of things to pay. So I had to keep on working. And then, like I said, as things changed, but also things in my life changed. And unfortunately, I had an accident. I was implicated in an accident. And that's when my physical capacities were minimized. Yeah. I couldn't even lift up a bag of flour, if you want. It took a few years for me to be able to get back to a normal life, if you want, that I was able to do certain physical jobs, without too much pain. So there was a lot of training that I had to, do and stuff like that to get back. Anyways, I did, so I was able to, but the installation of satellite dishes and all that, forget about it. No more of that. That was out. So then, of course, I had to change jobs again. But this time, I got myself a sit-down job working for these cable companies. I wasn't doing satellite anymore. I was doing, cable and cell phones. I was selling cell phones over the phones, and cable packages, internet packages. They were booming. Everything was booming, coming out, and it was sell, and that's when I would say it wasn't my last job, but pretty close to where we are today. I sort of retired with this job because after 20 years working for these big companies, like Bell and Rogers, which Bell, I already worked for them. But now things got crazy because it was you know, the computers and the programs and the trainings and the, the pressure and the sales. And you had to really push, and customers would call in, yell at you, and swear at you. But I didn't have problems with the customers. I had problems with the bosses and the pressure and the programs and all that. So I decided eventually that would probably be my last job. Then I started my semi-retirement, if you want. And then I started my channel because I needed a scapegoat for my relaxation. I needed some way to evade the stress and the pressures, out there. So then I said to myself, okay, I learned about ASMR. I learned about Reiki. I learned about relaxation videos, meditation, and the list goes on and on that I can use in my videos. But then also the technology, the microphones, the sound programs, the cameras. Like now, like I'm having trouble with my 4K camera. It just doesn't focus right. And the colors don't seem right. But the price of a 4K camera is pretty expensive. And I can't get another one right now. So I'm using my camcorder in the meantime, or my cell phone in the meantime, which I find the image is better anyways. So that's basically where I'm at today. Now that we're in 2026, and like I said, I'm still at my house. I've done so many repairs here. I'm doing, ASMR, my YouTube channel. But not only that, there's a lot of physical work still to be done. And now that I've built up my body over all these years, training it, exercising it, doing different types of physiotherapy, if you want, that I've gone through. So basically that's where I'm at today. But besides learning also that I had this blood condition that you get normally when you're like in your 70s or whatever. But I got this, I was in my late 40s when I learned about this because I wasn't feeling good. And it wasn't because of the accident. It's because I have hematomacrosis, which I think I mentioned before. I'm not sure if I did. Anyways, it means my iron is too high in my blood. My body absorbs iron 4 to 5 times higher than a normal person. So if I have a steak, I'm going to absorb 5 times more iron than somebody normally would. And they're learning more and more about this disease or whatever you want to call it. But there's no treatment. There's only one treatment. And that's that I got to get bled every 3 months. They have to take blood off me. That's the only treatment or only cure, that I have to keep on doing. But also, too, like in my videos, I mention a lot about, health and different types of things that you could do with your body. So I also have to watch my diet, that I don't overdo, with the iron. But as long as I'm getting bled, there's no problem, for now, at least. So that's one thing that's, stable because I just keep on doing it. but I also watch my diet. But certain things that I can still do, like I can still have beer, because that's one thing. I still drink beer, yes, because that's my Scottish part of me that comes out, gotta have a beer. I guess I've been drinking ever since I've been 16, I guess. But that's in my blood too. Gotta have beer. It's in the blood. But I can't drink hard stuff. No. And I don't take drugs. I do smoke occasionally. I'm trying to taper off, very hard. But it's getting easier because of the price of cigarettes. They're so expensive. So I do have a cigarette once in a while. But I can't touch hard liquor. I got drunk when I was at a younger age a few times. And I overdid it. And I can't even smell, whiskey or alcohol. It just, no, I can't even touch the stuff. I don't even like wine. So I don't drink hard stuff or anything like that. I try, be a good boy. But, we're only human. We're only normal. Like they say, we're made out of carbon. So basically, we're all a bunch of pencils. So that's going to be my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I tried putting everything together, like from the 60s up to today. There's so much other information I could process. I could tell you about, about growing up. But like I said, I don't want to add too much negativity in my videos. I want to keep them positive, So you guys have a more relaxing atmosphere. I don't want to leave you on a video, where you're going to have negative thoughts. Think of positive things. And like I said, the most positive thing that you could ever have in this lifetime, and it's going to help you, it's going to help your brain, is processing knowledge. Learn all the time. Anything, everything that you can. Absorb it like a sponge. If you can't remember things like that, write it down. Put it on your computer if you have to. Save it on your computer for a rainy day. But be a sponge. So don't forget now. I think I've rambled enough for today. So you all take care, because we love you, and we'll be catching you on our next adventure. Don't forget, like I said, if you're new, don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, give me a like, because there'll be more to come. Bye for now. Bye. And the years go by so fast.